Greetings, class. Today I want to talk to you more about the topic of frontier interactions between European settlers and Native Americans, and then the wars between those two groups of people. Two sources I want to look at today. One is by Kyle Zelner. It's titled "A Rabble in Arms: Massachusetts Towns and Militiamen During King Philip's War." If you're not familiar with King Philip's War, this was a war in the 1670s between the English settlers in New England and several Native American groups. It is one of the bloodiest wars in American history when you adjust it for population. What Zelner is looking at specifically is the militia of Massachusetts, and specifically the men who were pressed into service. There's been a long-standing idea that the English militia laws carried over into the New World, and that's true, and Zelner agrees with that. But there's an idea that he's arguing against, and it was sort of seen as these militias in the New World were militias where every man served. And that's true, every man had to serve in the militia, but what Zelner is arguing is that not every man actually had to fight. And what his argument is that the upstanding, popular citizens of Massachusetts really got to stay home. It was the outliers, the social outliers, men that were drinkers or gamblers or possibly criminals or not seen as members of the church. These were the men that were pressed into service, and they were pressed into service by town committees. And so what he says is the militia laws are the same as they were in England, but these town committees were something created in America. This was something exclusive to places like Massachusetts. In other words, there was a committee created by the town that actually decided which men had to leave and go fight and possibly die. And so he says this was all based on socio-economic factors. So his methodology relies heavily on social and economic factors. His sources, he looks at the muster rolls, men who were called up to actually go serve, pay list, who got paid for service, things like that. So this is kind of important because it does argue against the long-standing idea that in America there was a sort of an idea that all men went and served together. And Zelner says that wasn't really the case in King Philip's War as far as Massachusetts is concerned. The other source I want to look at deals a little bit less with warfare. It does approach warfare, but it's much more cultural, seeing what people think and how they think and how they live and the ideas associated with their lifestyle. But it's also social because it deals with two distinct groups of people. This book is written by Colin Calloway. If you're not familiar with Colin Calloway, he's one of the celebrities of colonial American history, if you could call him that. He's a very prominent historian in this field. This book is called White People, Indians, and Highlanders: Tribal People and Colonial Encounters in Scotland and America. And it's interesting because what he's looking at is two groups of people that, most of the time at a glance we would say are very different. Scottish Highlanders and, of course, Eastern Woodland Indians. And he says actually these two groups are very similar in the context of English colonialism. And so he says there's cultural similarities and parallel experiences between these two groups. So we're talking about Scottish Highlanders and Native Americans. And what he says is they both end up resisting colonial powers, which would be England. They both get removed from their homeland. Okay, we're familiar with the story of Indian removal, but there was what they called the Highland clearances, where they actually removed Highlanders. And then they're both considered by the English to be a tribal people. They're both clan-based. Eventually, these two cultures do meet. They meet in the New World, and this is where there's kind of a fork in the road, because you've got these two similar cultures. They're dealt with by England very similarly, but when the Scottish actually come to the New World, mostly because they've been removed from their homeland in Scotland, they, in some cases, meet up with Indians, recognize the similarities, and they intermarry with the Indians. But in other cases, they end up, and this is the more common case, is they end up adopting more of the Anglo-American way. So they sort of abandon what makes them similar to the Indian and become more similar to the English American. So in the cases of those Highlanders that intermarried with the Indians and adopted some of their ways or mixed with their ways, they actually faced removal twice. But for the majority, those Highlanders actually fight the Indians and sort of melt into the mainstream Anglo-American culture, which is predominantly English. Calloway's sources, especially for the Indians, he relies on a lot of anthropological records. For the Scots, he looks at letters, personal correspondences between Scots. He also looks at diaries of journals and government reports. This is an interesting topic because it sort of shows the mindset on the frontier. And again, a lot of times we look at these English American colonies as just being with English people in them, or Indians or slaves, but they're actually Scots and Irish and Germans and things like that coming as well. And so it kind of gives us an idea of how they fit into this colonial American picture and what it means to become an American when it's all said and done. All right, thank you.